Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you on behalf of our sponsors, Neighbors in Action, Inclusive Westwood, and the League of Women Voters of Westwood, Walpole, and Dedham. I want to welcome everyone to this forum on policing and racial justice in Westwood. I'm Marianne Wattendorf. I'll be one of the moderators tonight. I'll be sharing the moderator's role with Josh Ames. Both Josh and I are members of Neighbors in Action. The motivation for hosting this forum tonight grew out of discussions between neighbors and friends, in person and online and social media groups. These discussions were prompted by the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the rise of the Black Lives Matter protests nationwide and locally, including a well-attended protest here in Westwood. In addition to examining our own biases in our experience, many of us began to think about if or where racial bias and inequalities might occur in our community and our civic organizations. As we thought about policing in Westwood, many of us realized that we don't know a lot about the workings, the policies and practices of the Westwood Police Department. Believing that shared information is a starting point for valuable community discussions, we approached Chief Silva and Town Administrator Coleman to ask if they would join us for an open public discussion about racial justice and policing in Westwood. We're very pleased that both Chief Silva and Administrator Coleman readily agreed to share information, and both are here with us tonight. We've had a great response, a lot of community interest in this topic. It looks like we had almost 140 people register in advance. I think people are still joining us now. So before I introduce Chief Silva and Administrator Coleman and get this started, I need to go over just a brief bit of housekeeping. Okay, so here's our schedule for tonight. In a minute, I'm going to briefly introduce the functions of Zoom that we're using in the webinar format tonight and how you can submit questions. Then there'll be a few minutes for Chief Silva and Administrator Coleman to speak in their own words, tell you about themselves and their role here in Westwood. Then we'll move on to the questions. It'll be a moderated interview. Josh Ames will interview Chief Silva and present him questions in 6 topic areas related to racial justice and policing. These questions were developed with input from Westwood community members. Both Chief Silva and Administrator Coleman had these questions in advance. I do want to stress that we are specifically focusing our questions on Westwood and the Westwood Police Department tonight. And then following that, we'll have some time for community submitted questions. Some folks have submitted some in advance with their registration, and we'll be able to accept some tonight. That's where we're going. Briefly, we're all getting adjusted to our lives on Zoom. We're using a Zoom webinar format tonight. The event is being recorded. The Westwood Media Center has agreed to rebroadcast this for folks who are not able to join us now. To avoid distractions and be able to focus on the speakers, the audience videos have been disabled. All attendees are muted. And the public chat has also been disabled, but you can interact with us and you can submit questions for us to submit to Chief Silva using the Q&A function in the lower menu. And I just want to comment again, stress, we're focusing on policing in Westwood. We have some team members kind of working behind the scenes here, reviewing all the questions that come in. And the team may aggregate similar questions. They may paraphrase or edit to make something more concise. They're going to omit any personally identifying information. And they may, if their topics are just not relevant to tonight, they may direct someone to contact the chief or the administrator separately. And if there were any inappropriate or overly combative questions, those are just going to be dismissed. That's not where we're headed tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn this over, and I'm very pleased to welcome Chief Jeffrey Silva and Town Administrator Christopher Coleman. I'm going to bring down the screen sharing so that you can, your screens can show your faces as you give a few minutes to speak to the audience. Maybe we could start with Town Administrator Coleman. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your role here in Westwood?
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for putting this together, and thank you for all those who are in attendance. My name is Christopher Coleman. I joined the town of Westwood on November 25th, 2019 as the town administrator, um, uh, replacing Mr. Michael Gillette, who served the town for over 32 long, distinguished years and did a great job. Very happy to be here. This is a very unique opportunity for me working in this community. This is the community that my mother grew up in. So we have family here. I've been in local government for over 25 years. I started off with the town of Marblehead, worked in the town of Wenham, Lincoln, Needham for the last 14 years, and now Westwood. Also an active member of some of our professional associations, the Massachusetts Municipal Managers Association, the International City Managers Association, and the National Forum for Black Public Administrators. Again, very happy to be here. I'm very happy to join the Westwood team in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Chief Silva?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. So my name's Jeffrey Silver. I'm the police chief here in Westwood. I've been the chief since 2013. Prior to that time, I worked for the New Bedford Police Department, and I was there for 23 years in a variety of different roles. I grew up in Massachusetts, although I did move and live in Texas for some time. I lived abroad in Europe and in Spain for some time. And since coming here to Westwood, I've been fortunate to work with some very dedicated town employees and a great, very interactive community. We've been able to make some very exciting changes and enhancements to a police department that I think I was very fortunate enough to come to as a high functioning. Sometimes when there's a change in leadership in police departments, it's because there's some type of a scandal, some type of a problem, and they're looking for a change agent. That was not the case in Westwood, so we were fortunate that we had a great base from which we could jump to try to expand a wonderful staff, which we've only enhanced. And we've really been able to do some very exciting things. So I'm looking forward to telling everybody about that and hearing your questions and your concerns. And I'm sure this is going to be very productive. So thank you for the opportunity to reach out to people, notwithstanding the pandemic that we're in. This as challenging as it is, this presents us an opportunity where we can still reach out to people, which is great.
Great, thank you for your time tonight. I'm now going to turn this over to Josh Ames for the interview section. Josh, want to bring the screen share back up? I can do that.
Chief Silva, thanks again for being here. It's a real pleasure to have all these interactions with you guys over the past month or so to get this really formalized and getting going here. So the first question that we presented to you guys is about transparency. So fostering trust is one of the most powerful and effective ways to ensure the ability of a police force to carry out their mission. In part, this trust grows when persons in positions of power carry out their duties in an open and transparent manner. First, how does the Westwood Police Department ensure transparency in policing? Specifically, to which local, state, or national agency does the Westwood Police Department report data related to police activities? Are Westwood Police Department policies and data regarding occurrences and demographics of police interactions, uses of force, and uses of body cameras publicly available? And secondly, are Westwood Police policies as well as data regarding occurrences and demographics of police interactions, uses of force, and the uses of body cameras publicly available?
Thank you. Pleasure to be speaking with you again as well, Josh. So to start off with, in terms of transparency, I think transparency is certainly a buzzword as of late. It's always been an important component of government, naturally. Historically, that's what the purpose of our government is, a representative democracy, a republic, if you will. And so that's always been an important thing. But in policing, that's really taken on some new meaning. And I can tell you since 2013, when I got here, not that I think we weren't transparent, but we did some things that was really a paradigm shift that a lot of people may not be aware of. And it starts with something as small as changing what looks like a graphic on a cruiser. Those of you that have been around long enough in town will notice that it doesn't say call 911 on the back of the police car. And if you think that's an aesthetic change only, you would have a lot of company, but you would be wrong. I think the way that you foster and engender transparency is to really experience a paradigm shift where you're working cooperatively with the community. And so we put the town motto on the back of the cruisers, which is committed to service, essentially meaning no call too small. People identify with their police department in the number and the kind and the quality and the substance of interactions that they have. And so if you're operating in a reactive police model where the only time you see the police or think to call the police is when there's a problem, and you do that by calling 911, you already have a lack of transparency, because the police department isn't getting to know the citizenry in their day-to-day life. They're only getting to interact with them maybe at the worst times in their life when there's a real crisis. Similarly, the public is meeting that police officer in a situation where he or she needs to act with expedience. There isn't time for the understanding of who they are, where they come from, what their background is. And so when you change your paradigm of going from a response model to a problem-solving model, that's one way that you foster and create and enhance your transparency, because now it's not just the proverbial call the cops, it's you call the police department and you know the police officer who's responding to your house. That's one of the things we did. We then changed our hiring practice. Again, I'll say it again because it bears repeating. When I came here in 2013, we had a terrific staff, many of whom are still here, some of whom have moved on. But what we did to increase our transparency, a way that people identify with their department, is that they interact with people that come from places like them. They have a culture like them. And so we were a civil service police department, which meant that we had to hire police officers off a list that came from the state. And the only people eligible for the exam were the people who lived in Westwood the 12 consecutive months prior to taking the test. And so we were an example of the fact that you can certainly get quality police officers when you do that, but it's hard to broaden your access to the public so that you're serving a broad public, you bring in a broad public. And so those are two, we did many things, but those are two things that we did at the macro level to increase our transparency. And at the more micro level, to the question specifically that you're asking, we participate, and we have been since even pre-2013, with a national incident-based reporting system, which some people may be familiar with hearing as NIBRS. That took over for the Uniform Crime Report from the FBI, because there was a lot of criticism, and rightfully so, that the Uniform Crime Report was only capturing some very broad categories of serious crime, and it didn't touch and feel the more quality of life issues that a police department deals with on a daily basis. And that data goes to the state level, the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security in Massachusetts, and it's transmitted automatically to the Department of Justice through the FBI. So that's where that data goes as it relates to our police activities. Secondarily, in terms of our policies of data occurrences and demographics of interactions and so forth, we do have that, but the data in is only as good, or rather the data out is only as good as the data in. So if we get a call that there's a disturbance, for example, and the police respond, and if we don't have the data of who or which groups of people were causing the disturbance, and it doesn't result in a police report, which many things do not, then you don't have that data necessarily, like you would be able to capture on an arrest, for example, which goes in a booking sheet when you actually have a person in front of you. Or a traffic stop, if you issue a citation, you have the ability to codify that data. Not in a way, really, that many chiefs would like, quite frankly, because as we know, gender and race has become something that's received more conversation in the years that's come, and it's been, it may not be an actual evolution, but it's certainly a societal evolution in terms of how that's characterized. And so for a traffic stop, for example, police officers put in the race of the person who may be getting a warning or a citation based on what it seems to the officer, and so that it's very subjective. Many of the police executives, including myself, think it would be infinitely easier if the Registry of Motor Vehicles could capture that data based on the reporting by the person who's getting their driver's license, and that way there's no concern. Because you can imagine, although we haven't had it happen here in Westwood, that could become a challenge on the side of the road. If you're asking somebody what their race or their gender was, and they say, why do you want to know that? They may make an assumption based on why you're asking that question that is not really the case. And so we think that would be a much easier way to do it. The person could declare themselves, their gender and their race, as it were, and that could be right on the document, and there would be no reason to cause any conversation that may not lend itself to an explanation. It would be right on the driver's license. So we do capture that data. As far as use of force is also captured. It's required to be listed not only in the police report, but we have a separate accounting for that so that we can see how many calls involve force. Use of force is something that everybody has probably heard about, but it is very much nuanced. There are lots of types of force. I think people think of hands-on application is force, but force could very simply be someone calls for a loud party, a police car drives up, they recognize that it's a police car, and they say, oh, sorry, we'll turn down the music. That's actually a technical use of force, but it's not force in the way that many people think of. So that's something where you need to slice that pretty thin. But the use of force that I think people most oftenly think of when police go hands-on with somebody or apply some type of a piece of equipment, whether it's a pepper spray or something like that, there's a separate accounting for that. And lastly, body cameras. We do not have body cameras in Westwood. That's an issue of very broad conversation right now, not only in Massachusetts, but throughout the country. And their availability, the availability of that information for any department that may have it or that gets it would be covered squarely by statute. Currently, that's Chapter 66, Section 10 of the Massachusetts General Law. And with that, there's a lot of discussion that needs to go into that as well, because you can imagine that while that information will be very helpful in the interest of transparency, it would be less helpful if the police were called to your house, for example, by a neighbor who thought they heard a domestic disturbance, and then that same neighbor wanted to publicly request that camera data and listen to all the things that you said, or see the inside of your house, or see what was going on. So certainly there needs to be some legislative discussion around that. As of right now, that really hasn't been fleshed out in the legislature.
Thank you, Chief Silva. Actually, just a quick follow-up. So Westwood police officers do currently take all the demographic information during a traffic stop, correct?
The sum of the information, so race and gender, as it appears to them.
Awesome. So the next topic is accountability, and you already touched on it a little bit. So barring certain legal situations, all employees, including police officers, have the right to expect that their personal records should be treated with respect and confidentiality. However, given that police officers uniquely have the capability to exert force, deadly and otherwise, in the performance of their duties, a balance between privacy and community safety is needed. Would you please describe the specific process by which complaints regarding inappropriate use of force are made, reviewed, and documented? Additionally, is this information reviewed and disseminated to the public or public-facing organizations?
Sure. So the process to file a complaint against a police officer is the same whether the complaint is about an inappropriate use or lack of use of force, if they felt the police should have intervened and didn't, as it is for any other complaint for police activity. And they can take many forms by design, because the purpose is manyfold, but one, so that the public feels confident that they can redress their government, as they have a right to do. Secondarily, we don't want to have a chilling effect on people contacting us. So once upon a time, or perhaps sadly in some places, this is still the case, there's only one mechanism to make a complaint against a police officer. It may be in person, it may require a written form. Now, yes, there are benefits to making a complaint in person, because you can, like a conversation, you can have a back and forth dialogue to understand what's going on. But in some cases, people who may have had a less than favorable encounter or perception of that encounter with the police, they're not going to want to come into the police station in many cases. So we do take complaints at the police station in person. We take complaints right at the scene of an event where someone can ask if a supervisor can be called to the scene. We take complaints over the telephone. We take complaints over the email. We take anonymous complaints. And there are different types of situations lend themselves to a more robust investigation, as you can imagine. If there's an anonymous complaint, that someone saw me talking to you and I wasn't being very nice and they didn't know your name, that's very hard to investigate. As opposed to someone says right now, the police chief broke into a store at University Ave and he's carrying merchandise out, go down there right now and you'll catch him. Well, that's easy to determine and investigate. So we take all forms and fashions of complaints. We prefer the opportunity to speak to the person naturally so we can ask questions and also so we can follow up, but we don't mandate it. The complaints are reduced in writing by the officer in charge or the supervisor who takes the complaints. They make their way up to me as the chief, and then the investigation of the complaint gets parceled out depending on the nature and type of complaint. For instance, you got pulled over, you thought the officer was rude, or you thought the officer was okay, but you don't understand why there was enforcement taken for some reason. That might be handled, and that may be assigned by me and handled by a supervisor in uniform patrol, as opposed to you say, you feel like your civil rights, your constitutional rights were violated, or something of a more serious nature in terms of the offense itself. Any police misconduct is serious, certainly. That would go to our internal affairs principal investigator, who's a detective sergeant. Complaints are only investigated by officers of a higher level, so that if your complaint were made against a sergeant, it would not be one of his or her peers. It would then go to a lieutenant. So that's how those complaints are made. That's what the process is. The information is reviewed by myself and also by the town administrator and the select board. And so to the extent that that's public facing, I'm not sure by public facing if you mean some independent outside of town government organization. And if so, no, it's certainly available to any of those people because they can just make a public records request under Chapter 66, Section 10, for which the presumption under the law is that any record kept by the government is public. There are exceptions to that, enumerated exceptions. And so when someone makes that request, the law requires that we answer within 10 days and that we either provide the record in total, provide it in part, and the part that we cannot, we have to state an exemption that we think it fits into. That decision is not, I'm not the ultimate expositor of fact. That decision can be appealed to the Secretary of State, and it can then be taken to the Superior Court. And in some cases that happens. It's never happened here in Westwood, but in the state that has happened. You see that more often in a media situation, typically.
Yeah, I can imagine. You had mentioned that these are also driven up to the select board. Is that discussed in an open forum or in executive session?
No, depending, well, it has never happened that we discussed it in an open session here, because in the 7 years that I've been the chief, we've answered in terms of logged calls for service. By that, I mean people call us and we type in the address and respond, or an officer observes something and calls up on the radio. So one can rightfully assume that what's logged is probably less than everything we do. But in 7 years, that's over 200,000 calls for service, about 30,000 calls for service per year. So, and we've had only 2 citizen complaints. So
Wow.
It's not something that happens a lot. And so normally my first step would be the town administrator, who would then, depending, talk to the select board and in terms of, how much, was it a briefing? Was it more substantive? Would it need to go to executive session? It could theoretically end up in a public session. It's just never come to that.
Great. So now the next topic we want to touch on is biases. Biases are normal human psychology and social characteristics that no one is free of. In policing, both systemic and personal implicit biases have the ability to negatively impact the ability of police to protect all citizens equally, and have ethical and legal implications for both Westwood residents and those who commute through or own businesses in Westwood. So would you please discuss what training and practices have been implemented to address bias and how Westwood Police Department assesses the effectiveness of these policies and practices? Also, are data used for these assessments routinely reviewed and disseminated to the public or public-facing organizations?
Sure. So there's been a lot of work in policing in and around this topic of implicit bias. We certainly have done that at a state level in Massachusetts. That's been incorporated right into recruit level training, probably since 2014 at least. It was always addressed, but it was typically part of a broader picture. And it's in 2014, 13, right in that period of time, it was addressed individually as its own component area and then woven into the other areas of instruction in the academy. So in terms of training and practices, that happens right at the state level when officers are hired and they go to the police academy. In Massachusetts, unlike some other states, you need to attend a police academy of some sort to become a police officer. When I say of some sort, I mean either a full-time police academy, that's by statute, or a part-time police academy. In Westwood, we don't have any part-time police officers that work the road. We don't have. Some police departments do. They have reserve police officers. Our officers that work the road have all been to a full-time police academy. So that's changed at the recruit level. It's also changed at the in-service level. Those officers that have been hired and come to the police department, that's woven into the training, and it has been since that time. So we talk specifically about not only what implicit biases may be, but also perception, right? Because as we know, sometimes perception is reality. Again, everything really kind of circles back to the paradigm of policing. If you know your police force, if you're not just a 911 response model only, you then don't become an anonymous face in a uniform with a badge. You become an actual person. You humanize the police officer, you humanize the public. That in and of itself addresses the things that lend themselves to implicit bias, because now these people aren't anonymous figures. You're Josh, you're Jeff, you're Marianne. And so the recruit level, the in-service level, the practice and the policy of the police department, our hiring practice. As part of our hiring practice, we have psychological exams. So in addition to having multiple areas of examination of police candidates, all candidates are subjected to psychological evaluation by an outside independent psychiatrist. And among those things that are looked into, if you will, are not only implicit bias, but propensity for violence, psychological stability, one's ability to respond under stress, any areas of concern that match up against the nature of the job. And in terms of policies, it's directly in our actual policies of the police department, in addition to the Constitution, to state the obvious in terms of due process and equal protection at both the state and federal level, but it's in our department policies that we are to police in a bias-free environment. And everybody, regardless of where they come from, where they live, their economic status, and any other category you can break somebody into, deserves and we demand equal protection by the police. And again, humbly, I would say that if you take a 7-year data grab of over 200,000 calls for service and you have 2 complaints, that doesn't mean that anything or anyone is perfect, but it means that you're headed in a good direction. And certainly someone could say, well, people are afraid to make complaints. That is sometimes true in some cases, but the police department isn't the only place you can complain. There's the MCAD, there's the town hall, there's the select board, there's public meetings, there's the media, there's lots of places, there's the state where you can complain. And so I think all those things together and the picture of policing that we're doing at least speaks to that issue. And in terms of, is the data routinely reviewed and assessed? The data is routinely reviewed and assessed, and that starts at the very base level from reviewing the police log. All our supervisors who come in and they're in charge of the shift, that'd be the sergeant level police officer typically, is reviewing the log for a number of things, not only accuracy and trends and data of how to best deploy our resources, but also things of concern beyond the officer level themselves. That's the first tier level of supervision, is at the sergeant's level. So that's reviewed daily, each shift on the 3 shifts per day. It's then reviewed by the lieutenants. It's then reviewed by myself, not every single day from a deep dive, because there are several other people doing that dive. I'm looking at it a little more globally, a little bit more of a macro view than a micro view. And then we also routinely go through citation data and just, to make sure that the types of things that we're doing are consistent with our ethos and our policies and our practices in the law. And again, in terms of dissemination, I have the same interface with the town administrator and the select board. that citation data is sent to the state as well, who analyzes the data. And I'm not sure beyond, once they get it, whom else they may involve. I know in the past they've had collegiate level sanitized review of data. And in the past, Westwood has participated voluntarily when the state has asked for pilot programs for data. We did that prior to my administration, and everything was in compliance.
That's awesome. Actually, you
Josh,
brought
can I
up a
say
really
something?
interesting, Chris, you
Josh,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to, before we get too far away from the body cameras, just to point out that the body cameras under current laws are subject to collective bargaining. So this is a matter that can be discussed through communities and police unions throughout the Commonwealth. The other thing I just wanted to mention, and Chief, if you could just touch upon it, the uniqueness in Massachusetts of the required training that all police officers and the board that oversees that required training for all police officers in Massachusetts. If you could just touch upon that just a little bit, please.
Sure. So yes, doing in reverse order, the body cameras are a mandatory subject of collective bargaining. That's a statutory thing in Massachusetts. A town or a city just can't, implement it without that. And in terms of the mandatory training, I only touched on it. So statutorily, I believe it's Chapter 41, Section 96B, talks about that all police officers need to have full-time academy training, which has within it a variety of mandatory components, subjects that they deal with: implicit bias, fair and impartial policing, procedural justice, obviously constitutional and criminal law. And now after that happens at the recruit level, the officers then come and they go through a very robust field training program here in Westwood, where they're indoctrinated not only to the town in the kind of the basics, if you will, the streets, the various locations of town buildings, but also our policies and our practices and our philosophy, our policing philosophy. And then we police officers annually receive no less than 40 hours of classroom training at a minimum. That's the state requirement. And we have supplemental training that we offer throughout the year. In fact, within the last maybe 2 months, we just signed an agreement with a company, and this COVID certainly was a part of it, where we can push out training online and remotely to officers, because we found, as the world has with this pandemic, some of the additional training classes that we would send police officers to were canceled. And we didn't want to let our training lag behind just because there wasn't a physical location for it. So in the instances where the training could be done remotely with the original vendor, then we maintain that. But in the cases that we didn't, we procured this training package as part of our online policy manual. All our policies are in the process of being available to the officers online, not just at the police station, even from their home, if they want to, or anywhere else they can get internet access. We have a training module that's part of that as well. So there are many tiers of required training, from the entry level by state statute, at the in-service level by state statute, and then once they're within the police department that we're required to do. So there are several levels. Chris, does that answer the question more thoroughly?
Yes, thank you very much.
Great. So in addition, I had a question about the psychological exam. Is that common for police departments, or is that something sort of Massachusetts specific or Westwood specific?
I think it's quite common for police departments. Not every police department does that. We certainly do. It's definitely not Massachusetts specific. Massachusetts is, I think, unique in many ways in that there's a state statute that does not allow agencies to issue to perform the polygraph examination. So all the federal law enforcement agencies and some other states in New England are allowed to do a pre-employment polygraph examination. Typically that's used to verify some actual information that departments already have, but it's certainly a tool, and there's a variety of opinions on the effectiveness of the tool, but it's certainly a scientific tool to measure deception. But in Massachusetts, we're prohibited by state law from doing a pre-employment polygraph exam. You can't administer it post-employment in very unique circumstances, but not pre-employment. But we do psychological exams here in Westwood. We do the MMPI and the MMPI-2, which is a specific Minnesota multi-phased personality integration test, I think is the acronym, or something very close to that. And those are really kind of the industry standards administered by an independent third-party group of psychiatrists.
Great information. So we're going to move on to limits on force and de-escalation. So the current call for action to ensure racial justice in policing has been precipitated by consistent reports of excessive uses of force, including lethal force by police departments from across the United States. Excessive force erodes trust and safety for all members of the community, including police officers. Would you be able to please discuss the Westwood Police Department's philosophy on the application specifically of non-lethal use of force, including how use of force is defined? You already touched on that a bit. Incident prevalence in Westwood, de-escalation trainings offered to officers, and applicable Westwood policies and procedures.
Sure, happy to. So to take a step back, again, as you mentioned, I touched on this a little bit. I think when you hear police use of force, that conjures up some type of an image at a minimum, let's say, of a police officer putting their hands on somebody. Force really, if you consider in Massachusetts what we call the use of force model ranges. And of course, at the extreme end of that model would be the use of deadly force. And that's not, just to clear that up, deadly force doesn't mean it's force that it guarantees that someone is going to die. It's force that is likely to cause a serious bodily injury or death, which is why some people get shot and shot multiple times. Just generally in the world, that's deadly force. Yes, but they may live, and somebody could fall down and bang their head, or could get pushed in a struggling match. That's not deadly force. Holding somebody, controlling them with their hands while you're trying to struggle to arrest them is not deadly force, and they could die. So, it's nuanced, but it's an important distinction. So that's why when if you talk about non-lethal force, it's really less than lethal force, and that just means the force that's not intended or likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. It could. You could pepper spray somebody and they trip and fall and bang their head. You could attempt to use a taser on somebody, which is less than lethal force. But if it's used incorrectly or in the hands of someone who's not trained with it, and rather than using it as designed, you use it in an unintended method, it could become lethal or certainly increase the lethality. So with that distinction and explanation out of the way, the position of the Westwood Police Department on use of force, and candidly, I think this is the position of all police departments in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has some of the lowest use of force in general of any policing agencies in any states as it relates to law enforcement, is you use only the minimum amount of force required to achieve compliance from the objective that you're trying to do. So in the example I gave earlier, if someone calls for a loud party or a disturbance in the street, if a police officer pulls up in the police car, I already talked about the extreme end of the use of force model, which is deadly force. There's a visible presence. So a marked police car and a police officer in uniform just showing up is technically a use of force, but not in the way that people would likely quantify it or envision use of force. And so we would define the use of force as the actions of the police designed to achieve compliance. The use of the definition of less lethal force, less than lethal force, would be that amount of force used to achieve compliance, not intended or likely to cause serious bodily injury or death. Our policy and our philosophy is only to use the very minimum that we need to use. In terms of de-escalation training that we offer to officers, again, de-escalation training was always a component of recruit level training. It certainly has enhanced over the years. It's a post 2013, 2014. There was a lot going on at the national level, and there was the President Obama's task force on the 21st century policing, and there's a lot of I know it's not necessarily germane to Westwood entirely, but it exists and it's relevant at post-Ferguson studies of police interaction. And so at the academy level, it's recruit level in the police academy, there has been specific focus on less lethal force. And then that was incorporated into our in-service training here at the Westwood level. It was also incorporated in the annual in-service training for all police officers. And it was really woven into our more globalized, homogenized, use of force. Once upon a time, when I was first a police officer, you would hear policing in Massachusetts refer to use of force by the police as a use of force continuum. That's changed because, again, I know this may sound academic, but the use of the word continuum almost connotes that once you start on a path, you continue along that path in an escalating fashion. And so the philosophy and the verbiage and the vernacular was changed to the use of force model, so that you could ebb and flow on the model of force from a mere presence. Perhaps the situation, circumstances would occur that would require an officer to escalate, and then that officer could de-escalate based on his or her perceptions and the perceptions of not only of what the person was doing, but objectively what was taking place. We've also offered a variety of training just over the time I've been here, where we've had simulated police potential use of force situations, computer-generated graphics run by a use of force instructor, where it's like watching a movie, and the police officers' actual equipment, their sidearm or their pepper spray is replaced with, in the case of the sidearm, it's like a laser. It fits in the holster, but it shoots a laser. If the situation calls for deadly force, and you just use inert, what would be pepper spray or otherwise, and then you continue almost like a very high-tech video game run by someone who is a certified use of force instructor, where they present facts to the police officers on this screen and they see how the officers respond to it. So we've had trainings like that. We've had actual shoot, don't shoot trainings. We've had what they call simunition. It shoots little, almost like paintballs, consider it a paintball, for situations where should police shoot, should they not shoot, how do they handle it? We've done active shooter, department-wide active shooter training for the threat that presented itself in a post-Columbine era as it relates to schools. And in terms of our policies and procedures, there's a lot of talk nationally, if you will, about things like, and in the state level too, choke holds and shooting and moving vehicles, and various campaigns and so forth. The 8 Can't Wait campaign is one that's known by many people. But those are things, quite candidly, that we've never done. Massachusetts hasn't trained on chokeholds, and more specifically Westwood. That's been outlawed in our policy for 30 years plus. Shooting at or from a moving vehicle, similarly. I mean, the only time you'd ever be able to do those in Massachusetts or in our policies as they exist would be if it were a deadly force situation. Imagine you were trying to run me over with your car. That would be a deadly force situation. But generally, the Hollywood-esque, running down the road, shooting at one another, I mean, that's prohibited by policy. Officers are required to report use of force for themselves and anything that they perceive as an inappropriate use of force, even by other officers, regardless of rank. So police officers, police organizations are hierarchical, right? In that there's a ranking system. There's a brand new police officer and there's a police chief. But even a brand new police officer is required to report what he or she views as inappropriate force, let's say, by the police chief. It's not restricted by rank, or it doesn't require that you have to submit that through some type of a chain of command, so that theoretically you're a new police officer, you think I use too much force, and I say, well, I'm the chief, you can't report me, type of thing. We have a duty to intervene in our policy similarly, if a police officer thinks that another police officer is using too much force or an inappropriate amount of force. We have it in our policy, and it's always been our practice that when an arrest is made, let's state the obvious. Sometimes people who are arrested are not happy about it, right? They may have been in a situation where they were out of control, and that's why they were arrested. Sometimes they vilify that police officer because he or she becomes the face of evil because he or she is the person who brought them into custody. And so we'll have the supervisor or another police officer come in and conduct the paperwork and the booking process as part of a more systemic process of de-escalation and trying to calm down the volatility and to make sure people have an opportunity to not get more upset and not make a situation worse and exacerbate what was already probably a traumatic experience. So there's so many things that we do in and around this topic, but I think I'm happy to talk more about it, but I think those questions.
You're very diligent in touching all those topics. Thank you very much. So we're going to get on to community collaboration. Westwood Police Department's mission statement calls for engaging in proactive problem-solving partnerships with the community. Would you be able to describe in detail the role of the Westwood Police Department resource officer and the Westwood Police Department in our schools and broader community, especially as it pertains to health and social issues? Secondly, what partnerships are in place between the Westwood Police Department and community organizations to address these health and social issues? And finally, are the data regarding demographics, types, and outcomes of police interactions in schools and community gathered and reviewed by public-facing organizations and available to the public?
Sure, happy to do so. As an aside, these are all some very, very good questions. They're very dense. They touch on so much information. So I'm sorry if this sounds like a classroom lecture. There's just so much to answer in these because they're so fact-packed and so many details in them. I want to make sure I give everybody the answers that they're looking for and that they deserve, quite frankly.
Yeah, and Chief Silva, make sure, definitely do your best to answer the questions, but I know plenty of people are going to want to ask follow-up questions too. So if you want to go into detail about any specific thing, please feel free, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty of community questions as well.
That's great. No problem. Happy to answer them. So we've touched on a little bit of the role globally of the police department, certainly, and our paradigm and our model, no call too small. The officers have heard me say so many times, right? They've heard me say so many times, if someone calls us, really, there's almost no such thing as a police call. I mean, there are, of course, but generally speaking, we view this as being a very integral part of the community. And many times, when people are looking for help from their government, and generally speaking, we're it. We work 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so, the role of the Westwood police officers in general are to be here for the community and help if we can. Sometimes that help is just, this is who you need to call, and we'll make the call for you. Other times we can actually participate individually. The school resource officer, similarly, does the same thing. We have one school resource officer currently, which is challenging, frankly, as a department, because as we all know, or those of us in the community know, we have a neighborhood school system. And so that means of lots of schools for the school resource officer to spread himself among. He does spend a lot of time in the high school and the junior high school, in terms of if you were breaking that down, but he has a lot of roles, and it's going to vary depending on who it is that he's speaking to. Like our job always does, it's all about the audience. And as I've said many times, it's if the only tool you have is a hammer, you approach every problem as if it were a nail. So the school resource officer is there for, first and foremost, to be there for that school community for whatever it is they need. In some instances, he's a police officer and he can provide physical security to the school. Everybody thinks of, about the terrible active shooter type incidents that have happened throughout the country. Fortunately, very fortunately, those are high stakes calls, but very, very, very low frequency calls. They don't happen a lot, but when they happen, they make an enormous impact. So certainly he serves as a deterrent and has a security role that he fulfills in the application of his job there. He also is an educator as a specific subject matter expert. So he's not teaching AP World History. He's talking about drug abuse resistance. He's talking about bullying. He's talking about alcohol use, things of that nature, being a good citizen, seatbelt use, cell phone use, texting and driving, any of the many, many things, depending on the age level that he is involved with. He tailors his activities based on that. In terms of mental health, the school resource officer is certainly there, and all of our police officers in Westwood, although we're not required to, There's no law that's at the federal level. There's no law at the state level. But we made a choice because I thought that mental health was a very, very important issue that permeated all aspects of life. All our police officers are trained to a level of what they call mental health first aid. It's a certain amount of hours in training that they have to go through to receive this certification. It's a national certification. It's done in conjunction with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We also have police officers more specifically that are trained at the community crisis intervention team level. So that's more of a trainer level. And really, it's not our job to be clinicians, but sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning on the side of the road, or when there's a problem going on right there, right now, much like police officers are not physicians, but we have some medical training, police officers need to have mental health training too. And so the school resource officer has a certain amount of training where he can work and do no harm and hopefully do some help. Certainly the school department has people on staff at a higher level of training, but maybe the school resource officer encounters a student outside of school hours. Well, there's no school psychologist there at 6 p.m. or 10 p.m. And we have relationships based on our mental health partnerships, a community crisis intervention team that we started here in Westwood. We're one of the earlier, I'd say, among the first departments in Norfolk County to do that. We have partnerships with everyone from town employees, other public safety agencies like the fire department, private sector. When the Westwood Lodge was in town, we had clinicians from the Westwood Lodge, Riverside Health Services, social services, community chest. So we have take a holistic approach, and the school resource officer is the facilitator for that at the school level and deals with all those issues. And in terms of, I think that goes into the partnerships that we have with community organizations, that there are lots of them. I don't think you'd be hard pressed to think of a community organization that we either don't have a direct and active partnership with, or a familiarization with, or an ability to and a willingness to interface with. Many of our officers, we have a very, very diverse police department, particularly in terms of the community. I mean, the less diverse communities are, sometimes the more challenging it is to have a diverse police department. I think we have an exceptionally diverse police department in the very many forms of diversity beyond the, I don't want to say superficial, but beyond maybe the obvious, perhaps beyond the obvious things that people may think of in diversity. There are many others. And so we have partnerships by even through some of those officers with their own personal affiliations on boards that they serve on. For example, the Gay Officers Action League. We've had officers serve on the executive board level of that, or things that, different things of that nature. And then lastly is in terms of data and types of outcomes of interactions in school, are they available publicly? I would say it depends on the interaction and what it is. I mean, there are some pretty strict privacy laws at the state level that dictate things with minors. There's things that go on, in schools that, a resource officer may be there, but, he's not really involved in necessarily a police officer capacity. He's there to help. He's another trained, concerned adult. So, sometimes there are interactions with the police that are available publicly. Other times there are not. That's really governed infinitely less by any policy of the police department than it is by the state of the law in Massachusetts as it relates to school and minors and so forth.
That's some great information. Thank you. So next, finally, we're going to wrap up with areas for improvement. You have often mentioned the importance of continually evaluating the policing effectiveness in Westwood. What is your vision for the future of policing and racial equality in Westwood? And are there any specific areas you would like to improve as it pertains to ensuring policing and racial justice? Is a robust review of Westwood Police Department policies, procedures, rules, and regulations planned to determine whether there are areas for potential improvement? If so, would such a review be open to public input and participation?
Okay. So in terms of my vision for policing in Westwood now and into the future, not just as it relates to racial equality, but certainly that's a component of it, is for our police department to be progressive and to be on the front lines of how it is that we can best help people. how it is that we can service our community. I don't think policing anywhere, but I'm going to confine my opinion to Westwood, is one size fits all. It really depends not only on the community itself, but what's going on in the community at that time. And so that's going to be very varied. We respond to calls for an elderly residents that feel like they hear a noise in their backyard. And when we get there, the officers, not only because they're trained that way, not only because it's just part of our general ethos, but I think we need to give credit for where credit's due. Really the quality of the type of people, the men and women that work here in Westwood, they're looking to solve that problem. So again, not the 911 response, hear a noise in the backyard, drive by with the spotlight, nobody's in the backyard, drive off. Get out, knock on the door, have the dispatcher on the phone with the person, the police officer's at the door. Can she speak to you? You thought you heard a noise. Did you turn on the light? No, my light, it's burnt out and I'm waiting for my son or daughter to come change that, but they live in Hartford and then, I'll see them at the holiday. We've changed more light bulbs probably than some electricians that have a flourishing practice, and that's okay. That's what we do, and that's part of our job, right? It's that no call too small. So my future and my vision for policing really isn't very far removed at all from what it is that we do. When I came here from New Bedford, I was really blessed to have had the opportunity to work with and for some terrific people in a very engaged community, sometimes under some incredibly challenging circumstances, both crime-wise, budget-wise. And I wanted to bring, that experience here for how do we modernize our equipment. That's an important thing. When I came to Westwood, we didn't have tasers. We had, pistols that were fine, but the police, thank God, don't use their pistols very often. We've shot one person in the history of Westwood, as far as I can tell, as far as it's recorded. It's someone who shot and killed a Westwood police officer, William Sheehan, in 1975. It's important to make sure the equipment you have, if you need to use it, is modern so you don't hurt other people. That depends on what kind of sights are on the pistol, what kind of bullets are in the pistol, if you do need to use it. But in the vast majority of times you don't. What other tools do you have to use? A taser. We didn't have them. And that really just becomes an industry standard. Think about defibrillators now. Everywhere you go, there's a defibrillator. But when some of us, I'll speak for myself, were kids growing up, you didn't even hear about that. That was a piece of high-tech equipment, maybe that was in the hospital. But now, as that standard of care and that expectation of care has evolved, you often find yourself surprised if you go to the gym or somewhere else and you don't see a defibrillator. It was the same with tasers. Why is that important? Because the police need to maintain law and keep people safe, but they need to do it consistent with a philosophy where it's the least amount of force possible. Well, how do you modulate force? If I'm Shaquille O'Neal and I'm 7'1" and 300 pounds and I'm as strong as a mountain, even if I have to use physical force with my hands on you one time, what feels like not a lot of force to me may feel like a lot of force to you if you're 5'4" and 130 pounds. Conversely, if I'm 5'4" and 130 pounds and you're Shaquille O'Neal, I may feel like, gee, no piece of equipment I have is going to keep me alive, keep me safe, and keep me able to protect other people. I might have to use a higher level of force than I might otherwise want to use. When you have something like a taser, it's modulated. It's consistent. It doesn't matter how big or how strong or how small or how fast the officer is. It's downloadable. It's transparent. If someone says the police used the taser 10 times, all the data from the taser is automatically uploaded to a system into the cloud that we don't even control. I can go in and look and say, no, Officer Ames' taser was deployed one time, not 10. Now we can see who else was working, and doesn't mean someone else's taser wasn't deployed 10 times, but you have a level of transparency and technology and progressiveness and science and humanity and compassionate where you can deal with the situation and hopefully get the people the help that you need. And so my vision for policing in Westwood now is what it always was, that we help people however it is that we can help them, that we maximize the opportunities that we have available to us with the extent it's fiscally possible, We can't drive the Millennium Falcon, even though it might help with traffic congestion on 109. However, we can take advantage of technological advancements in training and education to make sure we deliver the best service we can and that we police with the community rather than over the community. And I would submit the voluminous number of letters and cards and high fives and thank yous and calls for service that turn out as positively as they do is a result not only of a police department that cares and that has quality people and is consistently looking to do things better every single day and not rest on its laurels. It's because we police in a community with people who care, who want to be part of the community, who respect the police as partners, and we all work together. And so that's my vision. And in terms of a robust review of policies and procedures and to try to determine whether there's room for potential improvement, yes, that's always been a consistent process, but of late, because our staffing has improved a little bit, although at the moment, we have a couple staffing challenges, but we'll get through that. But generally speaking, our staffing has grown to address the needs and the demands of the community. We've been able to undertake the process of state accreditation, and state accreditation deals with looking at all the independently verified best practices for policing, making sure that our policies are in conformance with that. It's very methodical. It's step by step. There are, hundreds of policies and procedures and subsects within those policies that we go through. But we've tackled the most high risk, high liability policies first, and we're going through a policy at a time to do that. And we're pursuing state accreditation. And it's a process that some departments have been in for years and years and years. That won't be us. So if you ask me how long that's going to take, I'll say I don't know. But I would say it's not going to be, we would say the 18-month mark, maybe. I don't know. I'm going to say at the outside for full accreditation, but much less than that in terms of having policies that are in compliance. And like I mentioned earlier, our policies, humbly, I think they're as good as any. The things that people are concerned about nationally, we've never done and had it right in the policy prohibiting it, and other things we've put in there and done before many other places. Whether it was adding different lights on our cruisers, and you say, well, so what? I say, well, so what? That's, in traffic accidents for police cars, there's a massive liability. People get hurt. It costs the town a lot of money. That's town property. When police officers get injured, you have to treat them and take care of them and make sure you get them whole. You then have to have police officers work full time to take their spot while they're out injured. So, everything from as little as graphics and lights on a police car to tasers and equipment that you carry to policies and practices to full paradigm shifts from going to a reactive response model to a no call too small proactive model. So that's
great information. I personally am very excited to hear that we're already in the process of accreditation. I think that's going to be sort of the standard across the nation moving forward. So we're done with the sort of pre-framed questions, and now we're going to move on to the Q&A from the community. I know plenty have already been submitted, so I'm going to hand it back over to Marianne to start that up. Thank you again, Chief and Mr. Coleman.
Yep, my pleasure.
Great. Thank you for all that generous information, quite a bit here. I'm going to start with one question that from a resident submitted. What is the standard protocol for when a resident might call the police to report a suspicious person, maybe someone they don't recognize? Is being a person of color enough to warrant a response from the police? Do the police always respond to a call from a concerned citizen, even if the concern is simply seeing a person of color?
It's a good question. It's been a topic of extreme conversation. And I would say the answer to that, which I won't leave you with, it depends, but is the stereotypical law school answer to, well, what's the answer to this legal situation? The reply is, it depends. So when we receive a call for service, policing starts the minute you pick up the phone. And so again, in a more reactive model, if you call and say suspicious person at High and Gay, and we allow you to hang up, or we say thanks and hang up the phone, there's already a lot of problems with that before the police officer even left. It's an important point that question is asked, because I think an important point to bring up is it typically, although we're out there proactively trying to look for problems, police, it's certainly in Westwood, we're responding to calls. So while on the consumer end, if you will, if you're a person walking down the street and the police show up, quite possibly, in fact, I would tell you probably well north of 90%, if there's a police interaction with you, it's because someone called us. Someone said there's a suspicious person at the corner of High and Gay. We try to engage that person when they call, as we do with all people, to try to find out why they're suspicious. Okay, are they on just the corner of the street? Do you live on a dead-end street? Did you just move to the neighborhood? You don't really have much of a basis for who's suspicious. Have you lived there your whole life and you only have 3 neighbors and you know that they're vacationing down the Cape? I mean, the answer, it's like a flow chart, and each answer is going to take you in a very different direction, depending on what that answer is. The fact that someone is a person of color is, I mean, that's never suspicious ipso facto, right? It's potentially descriptive, certainly if there's more than one person. Perhaps that person of color committed a crime or is truly suspicious but doing nothing wrong. But the mere fact that someone may be a person of color, no, that's not a crime. So we try to flesh out the information right at the call end of what's going on. And then depending on the circumstances as described, and then depending on the circumstances as encountered by the police officer, is going to dictate a very different response. If your call is, I woke up in the middle of the night and there was a man, let's just say for the sake of your example, a black man in a red shirt and red shorts was standing in my living room. And the police car gets there in 40 seconds and we see a black man at 2 a.m. in a red shirt and red shorts. I mean, that confines the likelihood dramatically that this is a person who's just out for a nightly stroll. And so until the police officer can determine what's going on, that's going to be a very different encounter than someone just who's walking down the street and we get a call, hello, suspicious person, High and Gay, click. I mean, the police officer may just drive by. The reason why we wouldn't just disregard it is because, who knows? The police officer could drive by and say, oh, I recognize this person. He or she was on a wanted flyer from Boston for, I don't know, a carjacking or not. So just because the police drive by, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a problem. And again, this circles back to a paradigm shift in policing where you're engaged with the community. If the only time you show up is when there's a problem, when people see you, the first thing they ask is, what's wrong? That's a problem. So, that's really, I think, a little more broad answer perhaps than the question was seeking, but there's a lot that goes on to a call, even that seems as simple superficially as that. It is really quite a few things at play in a call of that nature.
Thank you for that thorough answer. We have received a tremendous number of questions here, and we are going to stop by 6:30, so I will try and get through some of these. A lot of interest here. So let's see, we do have a question here related to police unions. You hear a lot in the news about conflicts sometimes in other areas between police unions and towns and things that are changing. Does the police union, this is the question, just what role, if any, does a police union play in setting standards in Westwood?
Okay, well, let me start by saying the police officers, I mean, Massachusetts is a union state, right? So you're allowed to unionize. I'm not suggesting that I would want to prevent it, but it's not even something that's preventable. And the officers that we have in our union, past and present, that I've interacted with have, almost always, if not always, been tremendously professional, very engaged. Many of them grew up here in town, and they really have never advocated for anything that would be in contravention of providing a safe environment here for the town or administering laws or rather policies in the department. By way of more technical answer, so the police chief in Westwood sets the policies of the police department, and that's a managerial non-delegable right generally. I don't, in most cases that doesn't involve the union in a way where they could stop it, nor have they ever tried to or suggested it. So I'm not trying to suggest that they would if they could, because they've never done that. There are some things that by Massachusetts law are what they call mandatory subjects of bargaining, which means that I just can't implement it. It's not everything, but certain things. And Mr. Coleman mentioned one of those, like body cameras. That doesn't mean that someone department can't have body cameras per se. It means that the select board or the town administrator or myself can't just come in tomorrow morning and go, oh, here you go, let me hand you all your body camera. That's just not how it works. That's by law. So that's Massachusetts law that does that. And much like police officers or police chiefs get their authority from statute, police unions get their authority from statute as well, in terms of what topics they're allowed to bargain for and what they're not.
Could I add on to that?
Sure.
So sometimes people hear the word union and it comes across as a negative. The union is comprised of individuals, in this case, police officers, as the chief said, who either some grew up in the community, some live in the community, but they are invested in the community in a variety of ways. I've had an opportunity to sit down with some of these officers and some of the negotiating team members from the police union. Very good people, very fair people. They're there. They have a role to play. They play that role well. They fulfill that role well. And I believe that we can work things through the collective bargaining process. Some may take longer than others, but we have good individuals on the negotiating team that represent good individuals who are working for the police department.
Thank you. Okay. So I've just trying to move through the questions. I appreciate all these answers. So we have a question from another resident. Has the town or the police department ever done a townwide survey or an information gathering process to collect perceptions of, how residents perceive the Westwood Police Department, or, have residents ever been asked questions about their treatment by the Westwood Police Department? So do you do anything to seek information?
So speaking for myself, I routinely will go through the police log of logged encounters, interactions between the police and public, and call people just randomly. Hello, Mrs. Jones, the police chief. I see that you were stopped by one of my officers. Do you have a minute? I'm just trying to do some kind of quality control checks and just have a conversation with you about how that went. I've actually gotten very good feedback about that. Most people were surprised, actually, but yeah, very good feedback. And so I do that. I've never sent out like a town-wide survey. I think there was some specific verbiage there about town-wide. So I've never sent out a town-wide survey. But I feel like I have a very public position. I'm very open to conversation. I've been to just about every board and meeting in the town at one point or another, and some of them many times. I've had many a conversation at the High Street Market or anywhere else in town with people. So those are some of the things that I do as the chief. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but happy to try to answer it in any other way if they feel that doesn't.
Okay, thank you. So we have a very specific question here. Have any of your officers taken part in warrior training? Are you familiar with the branded warrior training?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard that. That's I'm going to try to answer that as briefly as possible, because that's that's really a topic. And I'm not suggesting that the person asking the question thinks this, but things that I've read and things that I've heard, there are opinions out there that try to typecast or even trainings that are labeled this way as, so-called, warrior training. And it's, it speaks to the, almost like the combat kind of military or, engaging use of force training that goes on in policing. And look, I mean, there are components of warrior training which is valid. It doesn't, it's not, it shouldn't be viewed entirely as negative, but I think there are certainly police officers or police agencies or police trainers that have made it negative. If somebody tries to kill you on the side of the road, like Officer Sheehan, make no mistake about it, that's a war. When someone is trying to kill you and take your gun out of your holster, you need to understand that the time for yes, please, and no, thank you is tabled for the moment, because you may die. Fortunately, that doesn't happen often, thank God. And so we don't ascribe to philosophically, nor do we train in any way, shape, or form where it's us versus them. In fact, I think I've spent a fair amount of time talking about just the opposite, right? The proactive, take off the 911, no call too small, committed to service. So the only time that we deal with anything of any so-called fighting or grappling or self-defense, defense of life, defense of others, is specifically as it relates to those situations where people try to be assaultive and hurt police officers or others that were there trying to protect. Not part of some other, I've seen things online like everybody else, right? And some of it's in context and some of it isn't, but, in no way, shape, or form is that our policing philosophy in Westwood. It just that does not occur. It's not what we think. And no, we don't ascribe to it and we don't train that way. Only topic specific related, as I just mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you for the clear answer. And it's slightly different topic. Resident has asked, we hear a lot about the militarization of police departments following 9/11. Has the Westwood Police received equipment from the federal government and has it been used? Military type of equipment?
I'm very glad somebody asked me this question. So the short answer is no, we haven't received any such equipment, but I want to make a very important distinction for people. There's a very big difference between armored and armed. Armored is like a bulletproof truck. Picture active shooter. Picture somebody throwing Molotov cocktails. If you show up in a Ford Explorer, the bullets go through the window and the bombs blow up the car. So you wouldn't, if we had, which we don't, although we have access to it through the regional policing group that we're part of, we have access to an armored car, which is a car that allows us to go in and rescue people that may be inside a school where there's a shooting, an office building, police officers that were hurt, act as a moving piece of cover so that if somebody's shooting, we can go and evacuate people. That's armored. Armed, when you think of military equipment, is like a Humvee with a machine gun mounted on the roof. And so, not that this person thinks this, I'm not suggesting whoever asked the question thinks this, but I've heard this from people. When they hear about military equipment, they often conflate either actually or conceptually armored with armed. So if I could get an armored vehicle from the military, I would gladly take it. I would paint it and put Westwood Police or whatever else on it. If the military said, hey, we have a couple leftover tanks, do you need it? No. We have some armored vehicle with guns on the roof. No. So no, we've never received any, but they would be a limited application. But there's also things like bulletproof vests or bulletproof helmets that you can get over the years. And the other department I worked in sometimes was the benefactor of that type of thing. I think with some people, again, not necessarily the person asking this question here, there's a very negative connotation to that because of, there just is, for any one of a number of reasons. And so I think it's entirely possible that you can get surplus equipment from the military, although we haven't, and I have no plans to, where it's very helpful and the kind of thing you would want, and not something that transforms the police department into some de facto occupying force.
Thank you. And we're shifting gears here. We've got a few minutes left. I appreciate all the answers here. We're going back to the school resource officer here. So we actually sort of have two questions following up on the school resource officer. One, someone was asking for clarity, how often is a police officer in the schools? Is there someone in the high school every day, for example, or how often does that happen? And then the second part, a different question, is since the school resource officer is not primarily law enforcement, would the chief and the town administrator agree to conversations about replacing a school resource officer with a specially trained social worker or something equivalent?
So the school resource officer is in the school every day, unless he's sick. If he's sick, we have other police officers that are in and around and are tasked to make sure, which they are anyway, to stop by and have a randomized presence at the school. So God forbid there was anybody who had an ill-motivated intent to cause any harm to anyone at the school, they wouldn't know on a routine when police officers would be there. And when I say or when this person, I don't know if I said it exactly this way, but I definitely had a conversation that that is encapsulated in the question about since the police officer's role isn't primarily law enforcement, his role is primarily law enforcement, but his role is non-traditional law enforcement. So, I'm open to have any conversation with anybody, and the town can certainly have it. A town administrator and the select board can speak for themselves, and the school committee can speak for themselves. But what a police officer does in schools is drastically different than what any other job would be, right? If there's an active shooter, I'm not sure a social worker is going to help that. We know statistically that the active shooters are people that have either been recalcitrant to any other type of outside mental health counseling, or they haven't had it at all. They have threats that come from outside the school. You have domestic disturbances sometime, or custody issues that bubble over that can take place in the school. Those are oftentimes, there's court orders, prohibitions, restraining orders, warrants that are exclusively under the purview of a police officer. So, I don't know that it's something needs to be an either or. It's like anything else. I mean, the level and the type of service is going to depend on a community appetite and the amount of funding. But I would say, and I don't know that they're suggesting this, so I'm not accusing anyone, but I think to not have a police officer in the school, I would think, in light of the world we live in and the hue and cry that there's been nationally, even locally. I mean, I'm often asked if we can get more school resource officers. I wouldn't think that would be a security and safety enhancement, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything.
Excuse me, Marianne.
Yes.
Chief, is the SRO an extension of community policing?
Absolutely. He's a very, in fact, he doesn't even wear the same type of uniform that police, he's got typically like a shirt, like I'm wearing, like a golf shirt, and it's got a little embroidery on it, and like khaki pants. I mean, he has his police equipment and his police gear, but he's very much part of community policing. In fact, in his case, he's involved in coaching. I don't want to start talking about other connections that he has to the school, because I'm not convinced I don't know everyone in the audience. I just want to maintain, his level of safety and privacy. But the people who know our school resource officer know that he's integrally connected to the community, and he's very much a visible part of our community policing initiative.
That's great. Okay, in the few minutes we have left, I'm going to try and wrap up a couple of questions around the theme that we started with tonight, which is the community and racial justice. And several people have asked related questions here in terms of does the Westwood Police Department have relationships or look to build relationships with Black organizations? Is there efforts in the police department to connect with people of color specifically? And folks have asked for more information, if it's available someplace, on the, say, perhaps the racial diversity within your own department.
Sure. So we look to make relationships with everybody we can. I appreciate the question and where it's coming from. And again, it's tough, right? Because I'm not face to face with the person. Right. So I'm not insinuating in any way, shape, or form any negative intent from that. But we're very much in the people business, right? We protect and love and work with and have an inclusive environment of all people. And so, in terms of just raw numbers, look, I hired the first Black police officer Westwood ever had, and then hired the second one. I hired the first Asian Vietnamese Pelican police officer we ever had. We more than doubled the number of female police officers. We have police officers of all religions, all Arabic-speaking police officers, sexual orientation police officers. But again, this is a merit-based system of people that are intelligent and articulate. They got the job because they were the best. They embrace and they represent multiple different cultures and ideologies, and I'm proud of that, and we work for that. But in terms of, reaching out to, let's say a Black group or a Black organization, we reach out to all people, and to the extent that some people may identify, certain stereotypes with certain cultures. I would say, there are many, many more exceptions there are than the rule, right? I could be, a certain race and my parents are physicians and I grew up in town. I could be another race and brought up by a single parent in a low socioeconomic status, everywhere in between, crime happens regardless of race and gender and economic interests. So it's really a very complicated thing. So I think, we focus on the dignity of all people and treating all people equally. And to the extent everybody's unique, we certainly embrace, and we have a long-standing, very visible track record of diversity and inclusiveness. But people are people. I don't hire people by the color or the pigmentation of their skin. I hire them by the content of their character and their qualifications.
Thank you. We are coming down to the end of our time here tonight. Let's see, folks have asked for more information about the accreditation process. Who performs that, and what would achieving accreditation actually signify?
So they can look at the Massachusetts Police Accreditation Commission, MPAC, MPAC, and they can get a lot of that. Not that I'm unwilling to answer it, I can, but I know time is short. So they can go on their website, they can Google that and see what they have. It's they're an independent organization, so we don't get accredited, and then we don't accredit ourselves, right? Hey, we're accredited because we say so. It's done independently verifiable by the Massachusetts Police Accreditation Commission. What does it do? In a nutshell, it makes sure that we're performing up to the standards and best practices of the industry, that we're inclusive, that our practices are not only legal, but that they're sound and that they're scientifically verified, and again, that they're the best, they're regarded as the best practices in the industry.
Thank you. Okay, I think we are just before we wrap up here, and I say thank you. I don't know if Chief Silver or Chris Coleman, if you have anything that you want to say, kind of in summary. Thank you for all your time. We have a lot of questions, unfortunately, that we did not get to. We will send you the text of those questions so that you can see the kind of issues people are asking. I think we touched on one from many, many categories, if that's it. I know if folks have other questions, is there a follow-up?
If you could, when you send them to me, please, or maybe you can ask the people, if they include either a phone number or an email address, it'd be, that way I can actually respond to them rather than read the question and say, oh, geez, I wish I had the time. I would have answered that question. So if they give me a mechanism to get in touch with them, I'll be happy to respond to them. I think it will be easy for you to find people throughout the community that have said I've emailed them at various hours of the day and night, and or given them a phone call, so I'm happy to do so.
Thank you. I think we can reach out and get permission through registration to do something just like that, give them their information. Thank you. Okay, so this brings us right to 6:30. We promised we would end right there. I'm just gonna put up a slide so I don't forget the names of people I wanna thank tonight. We are just gonna move through this quickly. Okay, so I want to thank from the organizers, Josh, myself, and in the background, the team working on the questions, Jan, Vicky, and Rachel. All of us want to thank the Westwood community who helped us develop the questions. A particular thank you to Melissa Schaefer-Morabito for some helpful advice, Christina Martin with Neighbors in Action, Mandy Taft-Pierman with Inclusive Westwood, and Claire Galkowski from the League of Women Voters. Hania Curry-Trapper and Monique Damon-Johnson for helping us develop the promotional flyer, Westwood Media Center for agreeing to rebroadcast this, and all who signed on to the request and helped initiate this conversation. Special thank you to Chief Silva for your generous time and your willingness to answer so many rich questions. And Town Administrator Chris Coleman, we appreciate your presence and your help tonight. So any folks who want to get involved and engage in community, I know any of our sponsors would welcome your participation. So thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for all those who were in attendance.